Hello, and welcome to the Berlin Dialogue on Business and Human Rights. My name is Julie Schindal, and I'm your moderator for today's event. It's a real pleasure to have you with us from your homes and offices around the world. As we know, this year marks 10 years since the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We hope that today's event will be an opportunity for dialogue and frank conversation about our progress in those last 10 years and the challenges and gaps that we face. We have a terrific lineup of speakers for you today, joining us from Europe, Australia, Asia, and the Americas. I want to thank all of our speakers for being with us today. On behalf of the Federal Foreign Office, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today about our path forward. With that, I'm very happy to have Mr. Heiko Maas here with us in the studio. He's the Federal Foreign Minister of Germany, to welcome us with his keynote address. Good morning, Minister Maas.
Good morning, and good morning to all of you. High Commissioner Bachelet, dear Michel, Director General Ryder, Minister Hallberg, friends and guests. 200 years after the first labor protection we introduced in Europe, basic labor standards, healthy working conditions, and the right to unionize remain out of reach for hundreds of millions of people in our world. And too often, our global value chains create value only in some parts of the world, while they increase the misery in others. Many of you, ladies and gentlemen, are working to change this. And 10 years after adopting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, we have indeed come a long way. Consumers around the world are attaching greater importance to sustainability. The European Union is discussing a directive that could establish civil liability for human rights abuses in value chains. And who would have thought 10 years ago that Germany would agree on an ambitious due diligence law, which hopefully be adopted this summer? So, some might argue that the glass is half full. But the glass is clearly not full enough as long as men, women, and children around the world continue to suffer under inhuman working conditions. While the pandemic has made us aware that we are living in one world, it has also had the most devastating effects on the poorest. Progress in the fight against child labor has come to a halt. Labor markets have been disrupted like never before in recent history. According to the International Labour Organization, working hours amounting to over 250 million full-time jobs have been lost. And millions of people working in the informal sector are on the brink of poverty and even starvation. For them, responsible supply chain management is a silver lining. Ladies and gentlemen, protecting human rights is a duty all states have. It applies to the governments of those countries where goods are produced and to those who consume it. 3 points will be important in this regard. First, human rights, social, environmental standards need to be reflected in all of our international trade relations and agreements. Yes, we want open markets, but our market must no longer be open to products and companies relying on forced or child labor or on any other practices that violate human rights. Secondly, building back better after the pandemic won't work without protecting human rights along global supply chains. And many of our companies know that. They want to make sure that the quality label made in Germany also holds true for products made with Germany. Our new human rights due diligence law will serve as an incentive in this regard. At the European level, we recently introduced a sanction mechanism allowing us to name those who systematically violate human rights, and it also established clear rules for companies to break off business relations with listed persons and entities. And we welcome the fact that an ambitious EU directive on corporate due diligence is being prepared by the Commission. This is crucial not only to create a more level playing field within Europe, but will also ensure that our values and standards apply to the goods entering our common market and to the way our companies do business. My third and last point concerns partnerships. They are the basis of the United Nations guiding principle. I'm therefore very grateful that you, High Commissioner Bachelet, dear Michel, and Director General Ryder have accepted our invitation today. Through your work, you are setting standards that serve as inclusive references for all of us. In a world of growing political tension, this is ever more important. At the same time, we are strengthening our cooperation with like-minded governments like yours, Minister Hallberg. Thank you for sharing Sweden's perspective with us today. And thank you for being an ally when it comes to putting business and human rights on the European, transatlantic, and global agenda. And last but not least, we are benefiting from the exchange with all of you, policymakers, experts, and activists. This is particularly true when it comes to the review of our National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. The second generation of this plan is currently being prepared. It highlights aspects that go beyond regulation alone, such as international trade, the protection of human rights defenders and business contacts, development cooperation, and the support mechanisms for industry. We will make sure that these national measures will go hand in hand with the new policy framework on business and human rights that the European External Action Service is working on. And we will continue to encourage all EU member states to adopt action plans of their own. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us join forces to ensure that the working conditions of the 19th century finally become what they should be, history. It starts with the simple realization that we should stop producing, trading, or consuming goods that do harm to our fellow human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Maas, for your address to us this morning. We appreciate it. I'd now like to turn to our three very special speakers we have with us this morning to share with us some initial reflections and insights as we kick off our day of dialogue. So I'm very pleased to begin with Ms. Anna Hallberg, Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs from Sweden. Good morning, Minister Hallberg. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so honored to be with you here today. And first, let me thank our host, Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, for kindly inviting me to participate in this panel. Sweden really shares core values and interests with Germany, and not at least in the context of trade and industry. And in fact, Germany is Sweden's most important trading partner. And also, as Minister Maas pointed out, our economic relationship is an excellent foundation also for a jointly promote sustainable business in the EU and globally. And I'm also very pleased to be here together with High Commissioner Bachelet and Director General Ryder, of course. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the ILO provide great leadership and hold critical mandates for the achievement of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me be a bit personal. Before I was appointed Minister for Trade, I spent almost my entire life in the business sector. And therefore, today's topic concerns issues very close to my heart, human rights in the business sector. Value chains today are more integrated than ever and are key components in the globalized economy. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Production can only be considered responsible and sustainable if it's so every step of the way. My combined experiences, both from private sector and now public sector, has only strengthened my belief that the smart mix of binding and voluntary measures is the way to go. And that has Sweden and many other countries already developed. But we are not there yet. We have not reached the goal yet. Sweden, as you know, has a strong commitment to respect and fulfill human rights. In 2015, we were one of the first countries in the world to adopt a national action plan for the business and human rights in line with the UN guiding principles. And we have taken several measures to implement these principles. Our government have introduced a new legislation on sustainability reporting for major companies, which is more ambitious than the corresponding EU directive. State-owned enterprises, as well as government agencies, should, of course, act as role models in sustainable business. The government of Sweden has also expressed a clear expectation for Swedish enterprises to respect human rights in all their operations, both in Sweden and abroad. But it's also important to point out that most Swedish businesses have already placed sustainability in the core business models. They have extensive sustainability reporting beyond legislation requirements, something that helps boost the company's businesses and shareholder values. While there has been a clear progress over the years, there are more work that needs to be done. Taking the next step requires raising the bar further. Regarding solely on voluntary measures will not do. The Swedish government therefore strongly welcomes an ambitious and harmonized EU legislation on sustainable business with mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence duty. This is truly an opportunity to reshape global standards for a responsible conduct within so many industries, helping, supporting, and pushing companies in their work to ensure that human rights are respected throughout the supply chain. But to accomplish real change, there must be a system for follow-up and for enforcement. This includes effective access to remedy as well. The legal framework should clarify companies' responsibility to identify, to prevent, to mitigate risks related to their activities. This includes the global supply chains and should cover all business, even SMEs. The legislation should also consider the social dialogue between employers and employee organizations. Finally, it's not only the Swedish government that welcomes an EU legislation. Many companies, trade unions, and NGOs have expressed support for the initiative. And we host regular stakeholder dialogues to get their input for the process. It pleases me to see broad participation here today, and I wish you all a very fruitful discussion on how to advance the business and human rights agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Hallberg, for those words. I'd like to take the opportunity for a short follow-up question, exactly to a point that you made there right at the end, about the importance at the national level in Sweden of that dialogue, the social dialogue between government, employers, and workers. Can you share with us more insights about the opportunity in that social dialogue and how that works?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's also a question that's very close to my heart, because The Global Deal, it's an initiative that was launched by the Sweden's Prime Minister in 2016, and we now have over 100 partners. It's now hosted by the OECD, and Director General Ryder is very active in this initiative as well. Social dialogue is, of course, it's all about which kind of society, where do we want to have the dialogue within our society? Because we need to include labor markets and industries and ourselves, of course, in the politics as well, in this social dialogue that can only achieve results that are to the benefit of all these partners and all these organizations, if we can embrace that kind of format for a dialogue. And since this initiative was launched, it's been spread through many companies and countries and so on. And I believe that we must make sure that globalization works for everyone. And it's called Social Dialogue and Global Deal for Inclusive Growth, because it's necessary to reduce inequality, create well-paying jobs, and foster conditions for long-term growth through social dialogue between government, companies, and employees. And as Mr. Ryder and I normally say when we meet about this, it's about a win-win-win situation.
Thank you very much for coming back on that question, and thank you for your contributions this morning. I want to turn straight to our next guest this morning, and that is Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ms. Bachelet, it's a pleasure to have you with us this morning. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Dear Minister Heiko Maas, dear Minister Anna Hallberg, dear colleague Guy Ryder, and Excellencies, friends, I'm grateful for the invitation to address this important gathering, and I congratulate Germany on its leadership on the issue of business and human rights, both nationally and during its EU presidency last year. As you have said, it has been a decade since the UN Human Rights Council endorsed the UN Guiding Principles in Business and Human Rights, making it the authoritative global framework in a key area of human activity. Trade and commerce contribute enormously to freedom from want, to individual skill development and economic opportunities, to the delivery of important services, and to shaping future innovations for peoples and societies. But these positive contributions can only be fully realized if business activities are not also creating harm. The guiding principles are a pragmatic and effective framework for preventing and mitigating the risk that business practices will hurt people and harm us all. I'm proud of the work done by our UN Human Rights Office over the past decade to promote implementation of this milestone human rights framework. We have developed practical, evidence-based guidance based on extensive research and engagement with stakeholders from across the world to help victims to assess effective remedy for harm. Our recent BTEC project applies the lens of the UN Guiding Principles to digital technologies. We increasingly support practical implementation by individual companies and governments at the country level, for example, through business peer learning workshops, and by providing support and guidance that is tailored to local realities. We have also helped to create an annual forum that has become the largest global gathering on business and human rights. Many of the international human rights mechanisms that my office support have also advanced more effective implementation of the guiding principles, most evidently the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Other special procedures, as well as several treaty bodies, have also employed the guiding principles to analyze business-related aspects of the mandate. The open-ended intergovernmental working group that is currently drafting a legally binding instrument on business and human rights seems very likely to encompass key elements of the guiding principles. And governments across the world have done vital work to promote implementation. Initially, many states focus on developing national action plans on business and human rights. Several of these plans are now being updated, particularly in Europe, while new national processes continue to be launched, including in Asia and Latin America. More recently, and especially in Europe, including Germany, mandatory standards are being developed for human rights due diligence rules, as the minister has mentioned. And I strongly welcome these efforts as a key component of the smart mix of measures the UN Guiding Principles call for. In addition, it's important to note that many companies have taken important action to meet their human rights responsibility under the guiding principles with preventing due diligence and accountability for errors and flaws. Recently, we have seen major efforts by some companies to mitigate the worst impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their workers and communities. I also welcome business efforts to safeguard human rights defenders and to advocate the protection of human rights defenders and peaceful protesters. It is vital to acknowledge the contributions of civil society, trade unions, and national human rights institutions in promoting effective implementation of the guiding principles by both states and businesses. But despite these many examples of positive effort, we need to be clear. A great deal of work remains to be done to protect people from business-related human rights harms. Many more governments and many more companies need to step up or even begin their efforts. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights is currently charting a roadmap for the next decade of action to focus our efforts to implement the guiding principle more widely and deeply. In facing both climate change and challenges related to the pandemic, including fractured communities, broken economic sectors, a new reliance on digital tools, and the deepening shadow of commercial and state surveillance, I'm confident that the guiding principles will be a strong compass to assist policymakers and companies to advance human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner Bachelet, for those remarks. And later today, we will have the pleasure of speaking with members from the working group, so the conversation will continue. I'd like to pose a brief follow-up question. Throughout this morning, we've been hearing about this critical mix of measures that are voluntary and mandatory, and we're seeing a trend in the direction of ensuring that mandatory measures are there as well as voluntary measures. What do you make of this trend toward mandatory human rights due diligence measures? What do you see as opportunities and perhaps risks?
Well, I've been asked by many business CEOs about this, and I said, okay, because this started as an initiative of Ecuador and South Africa in the Human Rights Council. And it's because what they're looking for is that, probably not everybody is very confident that the voluntary measures will be taken, or that it has taken too long, or that a lot of harm has been done. And of course, as the Minister Maas was saying, we have child labor, and we have seen it increase now during the pandemic, of course, forced labor, etc. I always answer to them, look, if you do the right thing, if you respect human rights, if you would have a due diligence policy, you wouldn't need a treaty. But that's not happening. So that's why a lot of countries are supporting the idea of a treaty. I think the opportunity could be to stop all the harm, or to try to regulate at least the harm and ensure the remedy for the victims of the harm. The risk can be that, the one risk is that if it's going to be approved, because I have the feeling that the world is so polarized today, in our days, that there's not much appetite for more treaties, for more regulations. But on the other hand, for example, when we discuss about artificial intelligence or digital tools and technology, we see that it cannot continue that every company makes their own rules, because it's not going to work that way. And the risk of that on the bad use of technology is a big risk. So I'm not sure if there's going to be a treaty, but the important thing is that we continue working strongly so more business can respect human rights. And I think many businesses are so convinced of that, because they know that they don't risk their reputation when they have. So you can sort of sell good products because they are with human rights included.
Thank you for that. We're doing well on time here, so I'm pleased I can ask a follow-up question to you, because you've raised so many important points. And one of those was you've just been speaking about the future and what does the future hold for the way business gets done. And related to that, you referenced that the UN Working Group is working on a roadmap. We've just finished 10 years around the UN guiding principles, and now we're looking to a roadmap for the future, say the next 10 years on guiding principles implementation. What do you see as the main tasks ahead of us in this big picture as we continue to work toward the achievement of the vision set out in the guiding principles?
I haven't seen the roadmap yet. I don't have that information. Probably the colleagues were going to speak about it when Dante Pece and the other two colleagues from the group will mention it. But I think, there's a lot of things that the pandemic, not only is about human rights and business, it's also about how the world has changed during the pandemic, because there's a lot of work done. Probably it won't need to be in a particular place. You could do a lot from teleworking, maybe. Much more digital tools can be useful. But on the other hand, there's new areas where we need to ensure that how these guiding principles do contribute or not. For example, one of the questions that I ask myself is that if digital companies could use the same technology, the same guiding principles. And that's why we have been working on this B project, working with the companies, looking at their obstacles and their difficulties, and trying to, from there, to build better if we need another instrument or if we need to adapt the guiding principles. So I think one of the things that we will always have to be very attentive to new things happening, new developments, and how the guiding principles continue to be the principles that are adequate for that or not. Of course, there's a lot of things that online and offline are the same now, according to the Human Rights Council. So probably you don't need to adapt everything, because the Universal Human Rights Declaration is very broad in terms of speaks about human beings. So you don't need to include every diverse. One of the other aspects of human rights and business that we have been working, but still not many companies have done it yet, is inclusion in the company. Not only gender inclusion, but also LGBTI communities, who in many countries have to hide their condition. So that's something that we have been working with big companies on this, but I think we need to continue reaching out other companies so they can ensure that their workers also have all their rights protected.
Thank you. A lot of big picture thoughts there. And indeed, our world is evolving. We'll be talking more about that as our day progresses. Thank you very much for your comments, High Commissioner Bachelet. I now am pleased to turn to Mr. Guy Ryder, the Director General at the International Labour Organization. Mr. Ryder, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Firstly, to Minister Maas for convening us on this very important debate, and also for Germany's outstanding leadership on the important issues that we're discussing today. And of course, my greetings to Minister Hallberg and to High Commissioner Bachelet. We're coming together on what is effectively the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the guiding principles on business and human rights. And I think as we look forwards, it's quite helpful to look backwards and not underestimate the degree of progress, the road that we have already covered. I think it is reasonable to regard the adoption of the guiding principles as a game changer when it comes to the issues we are discussing, supply chain management in particular. But if the guidelines were game changers, I think it's also fair to say that the game is still changing. We are engaged in important and unfinished debates about the road forward. And I can say something about how that incomplete business
Bien, bonjour. La réunion du Conseil des ministres des Affaires étrangères de l'Union européenne n'est pas encore terminée, mais étant donné que j'ai des contraintes horaires, puisque je dois aller rejoindre le président de la République à la conférence sur le financement des économies africaines, je voulais faire un point avec vous à ce moment. Il est possible que le président de la République revienne sur ce sujet dans son point de presse qui aura lieu tout à l'heure. Mais ce que je voulais surtout vous dire, c'est une conviction à la fois personnelle et politique. C'est que c'est ce qui se passe, ces moments de grande violence, montrent que l'idée qui avait été caressée pendant un temps par certains, qu'on pouvait simplement ignorer le conflit du Proche-Orient, en pensant qu'il disparaîtrait de lui-même, en pensant que le temps arrangerait les choses, en faisant semblant d'oublier que ça existait, cette idée-là disparaît. C'était une vue de l'esprit, et au contraire, la réalité revient en force, violemment et avec fracas. Comme quoi ce sujet sur lequel nous sommes mobilisés depuis longtemps. Et j'avais été amené, avec l'accord du président de la République évidemment, depuis 2 ans, à essayer de trouver, avec nos collègues égyptiens, jordaniens et allemands, ce qu'on appelait le groupe d'Amman, qui avait vocation à s'élargir, à rechercher comment est-ce qu'on pourrait réenclencher le processus de paix, parce que nous étions convaincus que cette situation-là ne durerait pas. Et il faut dire que nous n'avions pas un grand succès d'estime, mais nous avions travaillé, nous avions rencontré nos partenaires de l'autorité palestinienne et notre partenaire israélien d'une manière ou d'une autre, et on échangeait toutes nos informations, parce qu'on savait qu'à un moment donné, il faudrait revenir à la table. Et ceux qui ont fait semblant d'oublier, aujourd'hui, sont devant cette réalité. La dernière réunion que nous avions eue ensemble, d'ailleurs, dans ce groupe de 4, c'était le 11 mars dernier à Paris. Je crois que une des raisons de la situation dramatique d'aujourd'hui, c'est parce que précisément il n'y a pas de perspective d'un processus politique. Et que ce qu'il faut faire, c'est de trouver les voies d'un processus politique, mais avant toute chose, faire en sorte qu'il y ait la cessation des hostilités. Et c'est dans cette perspective que je suis intervenu au sein de cette réunion du Conseil des affaires étrangères de l'Union européenne, parce que je suis convaincu que, devant l'escalade des violences, l'Union européenne doit jouer pleinement son rôle dans les efforts de désescalade, car la situation sur place est extrêmement inquiétante. Il y a un bilan humain très lourd, des familles palestiniennes et israéliennes endeuillées, il y a des images insupportables qui ne peuvent laisser personne indifférent. En tout cas, ce dont je suis convaincu, c'est que l'attentisme n'est pas une option. Et donc nous devons essayer de rechercher par des démarches, des pressions convergentes, la cessation des hostilités le plus rapidement possible, et l'Union européenne doit le dire, doit prendre sa part, et nous soutenons les efforts initiés par le haut représentant et ses équipes dans cette perspective. Je dois dire aussi que nous avons eu, depuis quelques jours, nombreux échanges avec nombreux de nos homologues. Je me suis entretenu avec Anthony Blinken, je me suis entretenu à plusieurs reprises avec mon homologue égyptien, avec mon homologue palestinien, mon homologue israélien, mon homologue jordanien. Le président de la République lui-même multiplie les initiatives. Il y a eu ce midi un entretien conjoint entre Macron, le président Sissi et le roi de Jordanie, avec un objectif de trouver les bonnes médiations pour aboutir d'abord à un cessez-le-feu et à une relance du processus de paix. Il aura sans doute l'occasion d'en reparler tout à l'heure dans son point de presse. Et j'ai aussi beaucoup évoqué avec mon homologue jordanien en rappelant notre attachement à la préservation du statu quo historique sur les lieux saints et notre opposition aux évictions de familles palestiniennes. Nos efforts vont se poursuivre, car chaque jour supplémentaire augmente les risques d'un élargissement du conflit à la Cisjordanie, le risque des violences à l'intérieur même d'Israël, le risque d'une régionalisation du conflit, le risque d'une remise en cause de la dynamique que représentait la normalisation des relations entre Israël et les pays arabes. Et nous avons, à plusieurs reprises, d'abord condamné l'action du Hamas, ces tirs indiscriminés, ces tirs aveugles, contraires au droit international, qui mettaient en grave danger la population israélienne, sous forme d'une forme d'instrumentalisation des actions qui étaient initiées, en particulier à Jérusalem, à l'égard de certaines familles. Je pense à Cher Gérard en particulier. Je pense aussi au débat qui se déroulait sur le respect du statu quo sur les lieux saints. Il y a eu de la part de Hamas une forme d'instrumentalisation de cette situation, mais qui est inacceptable et qui est totalement condamnable. De le même ordre d'idées, considérons que le droit d'Israël à sa sécurité est incontournable, que le droit à la légitime défense existe, mais que ce droit-là doit être proportionné et qu'il doit respecter le droit humanitaire international. En particulier, nous souhaitons très clairement et très vivement que, dans la perspective du cessez-le-feu, évidemment, toute initiative d'une opération terrestre ne serait pas à envisager. Je voulais vous dire ça et vous dire que, parallèlement, puisque vous venez surtout pour ce dernier point, nous avons pu constater, ce n'est pas fini, il y a une suspension de séance qui va reprendre, mais nous avons pu constater dans les discussions avec les 27 des convergences qui permettront, je pense, aux représentants de s'exprimer tout à l'heure, à la fois sur la nécessité d'une cessation des hostilités le plus rapidement possible, à la fois sur la nécessité de relancer le processus de paix, là aussi le plus rapidement possible, et de trouver les voies du dialogue, à la fois de travailler autour du quartet. Je vous rappelle que le quartet est l'organe de médiation et de discussion qui avait été créé lors de la deuxième intifada, je crois que c'était en 2002, qui réunit à la fois les Nations Unies, l'Union européenne, la Russie et les États-Unis. Et puis, quatrième point, nous avons souhaité, et l'Union européenne le manifestera, de travailler en lien avec le secrétaire général des Nations Unies pour faire en sorte qu'au sein du Conseil de sécurité, on puisse très rapidement acter cette volonté commune d'un cessez-le-feu le plus rapidement possible, ouvrant la voie à ce moment-là ensuite à une relance du processus de paix. Voilà ce que je voulais vous dire à cet instant. Je pense que tout ça devrait pouvoir aboutir dans les quelques minutes qui viennent, mais je ne voulais pas vous faire attendre plus longuement.
Peut-être un mot sur l'Union européenne. Comment mettre des pressions quand il y a quand même une division au sein des Européens, notamment avec la Hongrie qui bloque encore, et au Conseil de sécurité aussi, comment contourner le blocage américain?
C'est démontrer l'intérêt pour les uns et pour les autres d'un processus qui pourrait s'appuyer sur un cessez-le-feu, parce que il est aussi, de notre point de vue, de l'intérêt d'Israël que ce cessez-le-feu puisse avoir lieu. Il est de l'intérêt des populations civiles, des palestiniennes et israéliennes, et nous faisons valoir ces argumentaires auprès des uns et des autres. Il y a aussi nécessité que l'Europe parle d'une seule voix. Et cette convergence que je sens se dessiner aujourd'hui, normalement, devrait le permettre. Et l'Europe qui parle d'une seule voix, elle a du poids. Sur les États-Unis d'Amérique, nous avons pu échanger à plusieurs reprises avec Tony Blinken. Ils sont aujourd'hui dans la réflexion sur leur possibilité d'initiative. Si d'aventure on mettait en œuvre le dispositif du quartet, ça permettrait de trouver le lieu ad hoc pour poursuivre la discussion et permettre l'élaboration d'un processus qui pourrait intervenir postérieurement. Il est certain aussi que la situation politique et en Israël et du côté des territoires n'arrange pas la situation. Je pense que jamais on n'a été devant une situation aussi grave dans le conflit israélo-palestinien, puisqu'on a eu des crises antérieures. On semblait, je vous le dis, oublier cette situation difficile. Et puis là, il y a à la fois ces attaques de roquettes inacceptables de la part du Hamas, cette riposte que nous estimons devoir rester proportionnée de la part d'Israël, mais en même temps des situations conflictuelles en Cisjordanie, des situations conflictuelles en Israël même, dans les villes israéliennes, et puis des risques au niveau de la région, puisqu'on a vu, je l'ai dit il y a un instant, des tirs à partir du sud Liban et aussi quelques tirs depuis la Syrie. Donc il y a des risques d'embrasement. C'est pour ça que l'intérêt de tous, c'est de faire en sorte que l'on puisse, je l'espère au sein du Conseil de sécurité, arriver rapidement à une position claire sur la cessation des hostilités.
Est-ce qu'il y a une évolution de la position française quand on entend dire cette semaine qu'Israël a droit à se défendre, très bien, qui est plus proche de la position américaine? Là, vous précisez que cette riposte doit être proportionnée. Est-ce qu'elle l'est proportionnée?
On l'a toujours dit. Donc on a toujours dit que la légitime défense existait, puisque le point de départ des actions agressives est bien un point de départ du Hamas. Et qu'on pouvait comprendre que Israël, devant les attaques aveugles qui ont été initiées par le Hamas, ne pouvait l'accepter comme tel. Nous mettons Israël en prudence sur le fait que la légitime défense doit être proportionnée conformément à l'article 51 de la Charte des Nations Unies. Une dernière question.
Vous parlez de reprendre le processus de paix.
Oui.
Qui a été, pour l'instant, les Israéliens et les Palestiniens n'ont pas parlé depuis 2013.
Oui.
C'est que ce qui achoppe beaucoup, c'est la question de la colonisation.
Oui.
On parle d'un cessez-le-feu très bien, mais qu'en sera-t-il après sur
tous
ces points-là, justement?
On a toujours été très clair et très ferme sur notre condamnation de toute forme de colonisation. C'est la position de la France, c'est la position de l'Union européenne et c'est la position que j'ai répétée dans ma dernière déclaration au Sénat, je crois qu'il y a quelques jours. Bonne continuation. Je fais une petite parenthèse technique là sur la question de la Hongrie, parce que je ne voudrais pas qu'il y ait d'ambiguïté. Dans ce qui s'est passé à la réunion du Conseil de sécurité de dimanche, en fait, c'était un Conseil de sécurité ouvert, où chacun pouvait s'exprimer, et nous avions souhaité que l'Union européenne s'exprime, et c'est sur le principe même de la déclaration de l'Union européenne au Conseil de sécurité qu'il y a un blocage hongrois. Donc, du coup, il n'y a pas eu de déclaration publique de la part de l'Union européenne, mais là, de toute façon, le haut représentant va faire une déclaration dans peu de temps. Sur les convergences que je vous exprime même et qui le débat général vient de s'achever, donc on est en train de préparer le point final.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.